Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for another breakfast chat. And today we'll talk a little bit about the relationship between the overhead press and the bench. This is one of those topics to where there's very large amount of disagreement, to the point where you will see certain coaches out there who will say, my lifters don't see any carryover from overhead pressing to benching. I know people in my friends list who are like that, who comment under these videos. And then you'll see coaches and lifters who say, I see an enormous amount of carryover, right? And some people ask the weirdest questions, like I've had someone in the comments yesterday ask, hey, I overhead press X amount of weight for this many reps, right? How much should I be able to bench? It's like, that's not a direct carryover. It really depends on your bench style and your levers. Now, one of the things that's interesting, I have relatively long arms. Actually, I have very long arms relative to my height. I have long arms. Again, one reason my arms don't look big ever, even when I train them hard. It's a factor. But one of the things that I've noticed is that with longer arm lifters, again, we get a deadlift advantage, so it's totally worth it. Oftentimes, we're a lot better at closed grip benching than wider grip benching. Not always, but oftentimes. And a lot of times it's because wider grip benching hurts our shoulders, hurts our tendons, things like that. And so even we already have a huge disadvantage. We already have to move the weight a really long distance, way longer than other people anyways. So we don't get that much out of the wider grip bench because we're not really shortening our really long range of motion by as big of a percentage of it. It might be similar number of inches, but our percentage might go down. Someone else might go to a wider grip and cut their range of motion 25%. We might only cut it 10%. Is what it is. But one of the things I've definitely noticed is that for longer arm lifters who do a lot of overhead pressing, their closed grip tends to be better. You'll see a lot of coaches who coach the press, especially you'll notice again some of the starting strength coaches. A lot of people back in the 70s and 80s who really pushed the press hard when it was more popular, all noted that closed grip benching and dips are probably two of the best supplemental lifts for the overhead press. And I think this is where our answer lies. It's where it lies. I think that the amount of carryover that you get between the two is probably largely dependent on how wide you grip your bench. In other words, if you're out here pinkies on the rings or wider, you'll see a lot of guys who bench very wide like this who will say, well, I don't think the overhead press helps at all. I don't see it. Doesn't happen for me. Doesn't happen for me. But it's because of the muscles that are being worked differently. With the closed grip bench, what happens is you bring your grip in, what do we know happens? Your upper chest, your front delts, and your triceps start to take a larger amount of the load in proportion to the distance you bring it in. Keeping in mind, this isn't an either or, it is a spectrum, right? It's a scale. We know that the closer the grip goes, especially you start getting shoulder width, you start getting into true closed grip, it becomes far more shoulder dominant, becomes more tricep dominant, and even the upper chest gets worked more than the lower chest. The ratios shift. The chest is still a primary mover. I don't want people to think that you can't build a chest with closed grip benching, because you can. It absolutely works the chest, but it will work more upper chest and a little less lower chest. It's what all the data suggests. That's looked at it over the years. Most of it, not all of it agrees, most of it. So let's get that clear. So if you go find one study that's different, it doesn't knock out multiple other studies that found something different. And as we go wider, we use more and more pectoral. Okay, we use more and more pectoral as a greater percentage of the stress. The tension is being put on it. And it's not to say that the front delts and the triceps aren't still used. They clearly are. It's just that the ratios start to change. So what does this mean? It means that someone who benches closer usually finds better carryover, because what muscles are involved in the overhead press? Well, it's delt and tricep, really. That's what's lifting the weight. And, people will say stuff like, well, a lot of other muscles get worked. Yeah, but they're not that responsible for the weight lifted. Upper chest probably doesn't affect how much you can actually lift that much. Your traps don't affect how much you can lift that much. They play a much smaller role. It's delt and tricep. Delt and tricep. So accordingly, you closer grip, you're going to find that. I mean, a perfect example, look at Jim Wendler. Jim Wendler's a massive advocate for the strict press. And he always says, the strict press will carry over. The push press does, but it's not guaranteed to. He's like, I've never seen anyone with a really strong strict press who can't bench a good weight. At least anyone that he trains, right? But what does Jim also advocate? Staying inside the rings. Okay. He usually pushes people towards a medium to close grip bench. And he says that for shoulder health purposes. I've noticed the same thing. And as Wendler's always said on the bench, and I respect his opinion on the bench more than other lifts, and that's a different topic. As far as bench information goes, Wendler's is a gold mine of information for benching. I disagree on things like good mornings and some of his deadlift stuff. But let's stick with the benching. He's a massive advocate of the press. He treats it as a primary lift. But he, again, advocates benching in close because it's easier on your shoulders. He's like, it's not worth it in the long term to bench super wide or even be outside the rings. His opinion, even touching the rings. It's not worth it if you want longevity with pressing. You're going to bench 5 or 10 more pounds, but at the expense of chewing up your shoulders. Especially if you're talking about the long term. We're not talking about your first 5 to 10 years in the gym. We're talking about how is this going to impact you in the long term. He advocates narrow grip benching. He also sees an enormous overlap. Take other coaches who promote really wide grip benching, right? Particularly shirted benching a lot of times. What do they say? It doesn't even matter. I mean, delts matter, but not that much, especially if you get a really big arch with a wide grip. Because the larger the arch gets, the less front delt gets involved. Not saying it doesn't matter, it's still there. But I think this is where we get the confusion. It's where we get the confusion. Same thing, people say, hey, how do I bring up my overhead press? Well, you could do shoulder work, that would help. But what are the other pressing movements that help? Close grip benching carries over extremely well. You get really good at close grip benching, your overhead press skyrockets. Same thing with dips, particularly any tricep focused dips. And dips, it's because dips increase tricep strength. Right? Dips are arguably the single best overall triceps builder and strength builder. Right? Because again, we get better intramuscular coordination if we can go put more tension on a muscle. Dips have built a lot of really massive and strong triceps. What do you need to lock the overhead press? Well, you need tricep, but if you also look at the position at the bottom, you get a deep stretch. Even if you don't go all the way down, there's a deep stretch position on the dip, on the tricep, that you'll feel when you do it. Well, what happens at the bottom of a press? Your tricep, but again, a correct press. Like if we're going for maximum weight, you're in close, elbows tucked in at the bottom. You're putting that same stretch on the tricep. So it helps you out of the bottom and helps you at the lockout. But again, closed grip benching has an enormous carryover because of the front delt work combined with the tricep. It's pretty much the same primary movers as the strict press, but we can handle more total weight with it. We're getting more tension on those muscles. So this is really the key as far as understanding the overlap. The closer grip you bench, the more carryover you're going to see between your benching and your overhead pressing. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.